Ladies and gentlemen, in the past 15 lectures I have analyzed one sphere of human activity after another to demonstrate that man must hold reason as his only guide to action in every aspect of his life. Contrary to the claims of the mystic and neo-mystic philosophers that man cannot live by reason, it is only by reason that man can live if he is to live as man. Whatever concessions such philosophers may make on other issues of human existence, there is no issue on which all the forces of the anti-mind contingents have been focused with such violent intensity, no issue they have so fiercely held close to the power of reason as the issue of sex. In no other issue have they succeeded so thoroughly. It is almost universally accepted that sex and reason are two separate or incompatible realms, that man's sexual life bears no relation to his intellect, that his sexual activity is independent of his thinking and impervious to logic, that his mind is impotent in the sphere of his sexual desires. It is not necessary to argue that sex is crucially important to human beings. We all know it, both by introspection and by our observation of others. We know that no other subject is of so intense a concern to people. We know that they think about sex, they dream about sex, they write novels about sex, they respond eagerly to any advertisements that offer them books, plays, movies, or scandal exposés about sex. They have nervous breakdowns over sex, they wreck their lives over sex, sometimes they even commit murders over sex. Everybody knows it, but nobody has explained why. What is the role of sex in man's life? The answer given by ancient sages, by modern philosophers, or by any man on the street is the same, whether stated in poetic metaphors, in medical language, or in crude vulgarities. They all declare, in effect, that the issue of sex is a self-evident, irreducible primary, requiring no explanation. Or they believe they have explained it by declaring that sex is an instinct, or that such is human nature. Such, of course, is human nature, but the question is, what is it in human nature that causes man's intense concern with sex? That is the question I shall discuss tonight. In spite of our modern culture's alleged enlightenment and scientific sophistication, the modern man's view of sex, like his code of morality, is in essence the same primordial view that infiltrated Western civilization from the mystic cults of the Orient. Metaphysically, that view regards man's nature as consisting of two opposite antagonistic elements, of soul and body, with the soul representing some higher, nobler dimension, and the body representing man's lower animal nature, which belongs to this earth. Man's values, according to this dichotomy, pertain to his soul and are not merely unrelated to, but opposed to, the actions and the needs of his body. Man's body and any pleasure he may seek on earth are base and evil by nature. Therefore, man's virtue consists of renouncing any form of material concern or sensual enjoyment, such as wealth, luxury, production, trade, sex. Sex has always been the focal point of every mystic's attack on man and on existence. Since sex is the most intense form of pleasure that man can experience, it was damned as the most sinful. It was damned as brutal, impure, unclean, evil by its very nature. Chastity, virginity, abstinence were held as virtues, the triumph of the soul over the body. Plato was the transmission belt who carried this view from the Oriental mysticism of the Orphics into Western civilization, and immortalized it in the concept that bears his name, Platonic love. According to Plato, real love is a pure, selfless emotion of the spirit, untainted by any trace of selfish, physical, sexual desire. And sexual desire is an animal instinct of man's body, unrelated to the values of his spirit. Plato's dichotomy was accepted by St. Paul, by Augustine, and by all the philosophers of Christianity. In Christian culture, it became the concept of two different kinds of love called sacred and profane, with sacredness pertaining to the spirit and profanity to the body. With the evolution of Christianity across the centuries, this view of sex was somewhat modified. While the early Christian philosophers damned sex as such and regarded all sexual pleasure as sinful and evil, Some of the later ones adopted a kind of metaphysical compromise. They held that sex is not sinful if sanctioned by marriage and if its primary purpose is procreation. Married people were told, in effect, that the sin of experiencing physical pleasure would be forgiven to them if and only if their primary motive was procreation, and pleasure was only an incidental, unsought, unavoidable byproduct. This was the philosophers' reluctant concession to men's lower nature. Since very few men are able to be continent, they said, and since procreation is necessary for the continued existence of the human race, and the continued existence of the human race is necessary in order to supply God with a plentiful quantity of worshippers, sexual pleasure had to be tolerated in marriage as a necessary evil. Marriage was described as a medicine for immorality. Some Christian philosophers claimed that if Adam and Eve had not fallen from grace and had remained in the Garden of Eden, they would have engaged in sexual intercourse, but it would have been an activity absolutely devoid of any sensual enjoyment, an activity undertaken solely for the purpose of cold, calculated reproduction. Not being damned, they would have had that virtuous advantage. One of the consequences of man's damnation is that he has lost the possibility of a sexual act that would achieve procreation without bringing him any pleasure. Note this particular point. It is pleasure that made sex sinful. It is pleasure that the religionists damned as evil. Now, what was the opposition offered to that view of sex? In the history of the post-Renaissance philosophy, the only opposition to that view of the spiritualists, who claim that sex is evil, is the view of the materialists, who claim that sex is meaningless. The materialists, the modern neo-mystics, who assert that man is a mindless automaton made of meat with conditioned reflexes, the alleged champions of sex who proclaim their desire to set men free of taboos and inhibitions, defend sex in effect in the following manner. It's not true that sex is evil because it's a brute animal function. Since man is nothing but a brute animal, it's not wrong for him to engage in a brute animal function. Why shouldn't he? All his functions are brute animal functions. The only wrong is to pretend that they're anything else. Ladies and gentlemen, is this an opposition to the mystics' doctrines, or merely a deeper and uglier acceptance of the metaphysics held by the mystics, of their metaphysical view of man, the other and brassier side of the same coin? If the mystics of spirit declare that man is a swine who might have a chance to acquire some value after death, the protest of the mystics of muscle consists of declaring, "Sure, I'm a swine, but I belong in the muck and I don't propose to bother about any values." There are many men who think that they are rebelling against a mystical religious upbringing by embarking upon a course of mindless sexual promiscuity. They think that this demonstrates their freedom from mysticism. In fact, they have conceded the mystic's basic premise, that sex is an activity devoid of any meaning, of any spiritual or psychological significance, that is, of any values. Such are the two alternatives that men have been offered: a choice between the spiritualists and the materialists, between those who believe in values without pleasure and those who believe in pleasure without values. The spiritualists preach that man must pursue moral values, but must not expect any pleasure from them. The materialists preach that man may pursue pleasure, but must not pretend that it involves any moral values. Both accept the fundamental premise that pleasure and values have no relation to each other. In one version or another, the Orphic, Platonic, medieval view of sex still dominates our culture. Let me quote some excerpts from medieval literature written in the late part of the 19th century by doctors who should have known better on the role of sex in human life. A 19th century surgeon writes, quote, "I should say that the majority of women, happily for society, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. To maintain the contrary, to maintain that women do find sexual pleasure, is a vile aspersion." Another 19th century medical work refers to doctors who were troubled by the fact that, in certain cases, they observed unequivocal physical indications that women were not altogether indifferent to sex. Quote, "Physical signs of a woman's sexual responsiveness may be observed, but this only happens in lascivious women, or such as live luxuriously." Close quote. A famous 19th century German scientific authority writes, quote, "It is an altogether false idea that a young woman has just as strong an impulse to the opposite sex as a young man. The appearance of the sexual side in the love of a young girl is pathological," close quote. And here is a quotation from a man who is alleged to hold advanced views on sex and to be opposed to the traditional derogation of sexual activity, Sigmund Freud. Quote, "Anyone who subjects himself to serious self-examination will indubitably find that at the bottom of his heart, he too regards the sex act as something degrading, which soils and contaminates not only the body," close quote. No matter what part of these ideas modern men may have rejected, no matter how confidently men assert that they do not believe in the soul-body dichotomy, one consequence of the Orphics doctrine still stands unchallenged, dominating our modern culture as a monument to a very ancient evil, almost as a dark primordial temple still claiming human sacrifices in the form of lives wrecked by frustration, bewilderment, and guilt. The belief accepted by the majority of men that sex is primarily a physical function. There are many different versions of this belief and many different estimates. Not all those who hold it share the extreme materialist appraisal, which may be called brute animalism. Some people hold that sex is an animal function, but that there's nothing wrong in being an animal. In fact, it's natural or wholesome or even beautiful. Such views range from the glass of water school that regards sex as a natural physical function fulfilling a physical need of no greater significance than drinking a glass of water when one is thirsty, to the animal glamour school that regards the primitive, the instinctual, the earthy as romantic, passionate, and colorful, in opposition to the intellectual and the civilized, which it regards as cold, effete, and dull. The school whose view of sex is best exemplified by Hollywood versions of the South Sea natives or by current Italian movies about barefooted peasant girls. There are people who try to allow some place or influence to romantic love in the issue of sex in some undefined manner, which amounts to the belief that sex is physical, but that a good man combines it somehow with spiritual emotions of love, while a man who is less good does not, but indulges in physical promiscuity, unrelated to his mind or values or emotions. These various attitudes differ not in their metaphysical view of sex, but only in their estimates. They range in effect from the belief that sex belongs in the gutter to the belief which transfers it to the jungle, then transfers it to the bathroom, then transfers it to the bedroom of a vine-covered cottage. But the place from which sex is barred by their united front is the study. That man's mind, reason, and logic have no connection whatever with his sex life is the absolute they all hold in common. Reason, they hold, is an alien to sex, either an impotent alien defeated by the power of irrational passion, or a destructive alien whose cold hand kills the joy that only a mindless body can experience. As one modern writer puts it, quote, "The amorous choice is not a rational act, and one may rightly feel suspicious that where choice is rational, there is probably no love," close quote. Or writes another, quote, "The moment one is able to say because, one is no longer under the spell," close quote. Now, as we shall proceed to examine the issue, let me state at the outset that, speaking metaphorically, a man's sex life is determined precisely by the hours he has spent or failed to spend in his study, by which I mean by the thinking he has done or has failed to do. Like any other activity, only if possible more so than any other activity, a man's sex life is determined by his premises, held consciously or subconsciously. And the grim joke on the mystics of both schools is that of all the aspects of man's life, sex is the most philosophical, though not in the way that they would project it. Sex is the sum, the expression, and often the nemesis of the kind of philosophy a man has chosen to accept. It is the one realm where premises most inexorably will out. To quote Francisco d'Anconia, "Tell me what a man finds sexually attractive, and I will tell you his entire philosophy of life. Show me the woman he sleeps with, and I will tell you his valuation of himself." This is what I propose to demonstrate and to explain. Now, let us start by examining the question, is sex primarily a physical function? Obviously, the capacity to experience sexual pleasure is physical in the sense that man's body possesses the appropriate nerves and organs which are the necessary tools of that experience. But this is not the point at issue. The point is whether man's sexual apparatus is an autonomous machine that runs itself by its own will, or whether it is a tool, a machine run by man's mind, and if this last, then how, in what manner? The physicalistic view holds that sex is a purely physical phenomenon, a biological function that acts independently of a man's philosophy, of his moral values, or his intellectual pursuits. According to this view, sex is merely the need and the experience of a physical pleasure that involves nothing but physical stimulation. A man's sexual desires, preferences, and practices are determined by his body and bear no relation to his ideas or the rest of his character. If this were true, then the first unanswerable problem would be, what is the nature of the need for a partner? Why does one want to sleep with somebody? Why does one prefer heterosexual intercourse to autoeroticism or masturbation? It cannot be argued that this preference is caused by differences in physical sensations, because if we consider nothing but the physical stimulation given nerve endings, it is surely possible to duplicate to a high degree the literal nervous messages sent along the nervous system. It is not one's body that would know the difference. A few years ago, I had a male patient who held the Don Juan attitude toward sex. He insisted that sex had no particular spiritual meaning in his life, that it was simply a matter of physical release, and, as far as he was concerned, any available woman would do for that purpose. He insisted that the issue had no wider psychological significance and that nothing could be inferred about his character from the nature of his particular sexual choices. I said to him, suppose that you were provided with a life-size rubber doll constructed as an exact replica of a woman so that your senses would not be aware of any perceptible difference. Would you give up sleeping with women and content yourself with obtaining your physical satisfaction from this doll for the rest of your life? He drew back and answered, God, no. So I asked, why not? He answered, because in sex you want a partner. Well, I asked him why this doll would not do for a partner, since it would resemble a woman in every way. He answered, yes, but in sex you want a consciousness, not just an inanimate body. It's interesting, I said. You want a consciousness, and simultaneously you maintain that this is merely an issue of physical release. What does your body know or care about a consciousness? What difference would that make to your nerve cells? Your mind knows the difference, but your mind, by your theory, plays no part in your sexual activity. At this point, he conceded that more was involved than he had hitherto acknowledged. When you are considering the validity of any theory, remember an elementary rule of scientific epistemology. To be valid, a theory must incorporate all and contradict none of the evidence relevant to the subject under consideration. And there are a great many phenomena that cannot be incorporated or explained by a physicalistic theory of sex. The first is the desire for a partner. The second is the preference exhibited by every human being for one kind of partner over another. There is no man who does not possess some sort of sexual standards. The standards may be very crude and primitive, they may embrace a very wide, seemingly indiscriminate range, but every man draws the line somewhere. There is no man of whom it is not true that there is some woman he would prefer not to sleep with. Once we observe the universal phenomenon of sexual preferences, once we know that a man derives an intense pleasure from sleeping with one person, but not from sleeping with another, we know that the key to the difference lies in the spiritual or psychological realm, that is, in man's consciousness, not in his body. Because the physical motions involved are the same and the stimulation of nerve cells are the same, regardless of partner. If one sexual relationship produces boredom or shame and another the purest, most intense kind of pleasure, the difference lies in the realm of human psychology, not in the realm of physiology. Now, as in most issues, there exists a middle-of-the-road kind of theory of sex, the semi-physical theory, which holds that sex is not an autonomously physical issue of the body, that man's consciousness and values are involved, but that such values pertain only to the body and that one's preferences are directed by one's standards of physical beauty alone, proving, therefore, that the body is one's only concern in sex and that moral or intellectual issues or values are irrelevant. The example usually given to illustrate this theory is an experience shared by most men at one time or another of the following kind. Walking down the street, a man sees a very beautiful woman. Knowing nothing about her, with no thought and no time to think of her character, he feels an immediate sexual desire. To the best of his conscious introspective knowledge, her beautiful body was the only source and inspiration of his desires. The question to ask in such a case is, suppose the man approached her, became acquainted, and discovered that she is a vicious murderess just released from jail, or a woman who can barely connect two sensible phrases. Would his sexual desire remain unchanged? Any semi-competent introspector would admit that his desire would vanish. I doubt whether there is a man or a woman who has not had an actual experience of this same category. The experience of feeling a romantic sexual attraction to a good-looking member of the opposite sex, which vanished on closer acquaintance when one became disappointed in that person's character or intelligence. The good looks did not change, but the attraction vanished. Who hasn't had the experience, for example, of coming to a party, seeing across the room a good-looking member of the opposite sex, feeling a spark of interest, walking over to this person, and then the person opens his or her mouth, and one's feeling vanishes. The question to ask in all such cases is, what is the meaning of man's response to physical beauty? Observe that people differ in their standards of beauty and in the kind of type they find physically attractive. One's response to a person's physical appearance depends on the kind of qualities of character that that appearance suggests to us. The suggestion may be valid or accidental. It may be the result of observation or of chance association. But in either case, it is character that one perceives or imagines oneself to be perceiving when one feels attracted to a certain type of physical experience. Human beings form their estimates of romantic values early in life, usually in their teens. Qualities of character are hard to define and to identify then or later. But the values of physical appearance are the easiest to perceive and to appraise. Since most people do not identify their standard of moral values and do not know consciously what character traits they value or why, their romantic estimates remain on the primitive associational level of adolescence. But whenever a man responds to a woman's physical beauty, what he is seeing is the abstraction woman. And what his subconscious is doing is endowing that abstraction with the particular qualities of character, the particular values he seeks in a woman. He seeks them only by means of his own undefined, unidentified emotional response, which he should but may never identify in conscious terms. Whenever you are attracted to a girl's pretty face, it is not villainy that you expect to find in that girl. Ask yourself what it is that you do expect to find, and you may get a clue to your actual romantic standards. As further proof of the fact that the romantic appeal of physical beauty is symbolic rather than actual, observe the fact that many women who possess a perfect physical beauty but lack character, whose personality is flat, lifeless, undistinguished, do not arouse masculine desire and are considered to lack sex appeal. On the other hand, women who are much less beautiful and sometimes actually homely often possess an enormous sex appeal. Consider the meaning of the concept of sex appeal. Few people realize that the concept is a blatant denial of the physicalistic view of sex or of the view which attributes sexual attraction to physical appearance. Sex appeal means a special quality of character, an attribute of personality. Most people say that it is an undefinable quality, an undefinable something. But most people say that about any complex emotion. Physical beauty as such is a human value, but it is far from being the crucial or the determining value in sexual attraction. Now observe another point. If a man were to make a declaration of platonic love to a woman, if he were to tell her that he adores her emotionally, but that she does not arouse any sexual desire in him, she would not believe his love, and she would feel profoundly hurt, offended, insulted. The same would be true of a man if he heard a similar declaration from a woman. Very few people are willing to accept the idea that romantic love can be divorced from any element of sexual desire, yet these same people are willing to believe that sexual desire can exist without any element of love or spiritual valuation. Sexual desire and sexual emotion are determined by a person's premises, just like any other human desire or emotion. The body cannot desire, only you can desire. And just as any other mental evaluation that produces an emotion can produce physical consequences in your body, as for instance an evaluation of danger can make your heart beat faster and can increase the supply of adrenaline, so certain kinds of mental evaluations can produce a feeling of sexual desire, but that feeling is no more generated by the body than any other emotion is generated by the body. Your body is only your tool. Your consciousness is the generator of the values and purposes for which you choose to employ that tool. Before we proceed to discuss the specific values involved in the issue of sex, let me remind you of the metaphysical meaning of pleasure in human life. Pleasure is man's emotional response to that which achieves, supports, or furthers his values. Suffering is his emotional response to that which threatens, injures, or destroys them. Since success in achieving his values is the basic metaphysical necessity of man's survival, the experience of pleasure is the emotional proof and confirmation of his ability to deal with existence, which means of his fitness to exist. Thus, pleasure and self-esteem are interacting corollaries in man's consciousness. Self-esteem, the confident sense of one's own ability to deal with existence, is in itself the most profound pleasure a man can experience and the root of all the others. Every experience of pleasure, major or minor, carries with it a sense of one's own efficacy, of success in achieving the desired or desirable, of success in dealing with reality. An expression or reaffirmation of self-esteem, or, to state it more precisely, a sense of efficacy is the form of inner awareness which gives man the emotional reality of his own self-esteem. Action and values are inseparable corollaries in man's life. Values to be gained or kept require action. Action is motivated, consciously or subconsciously, by the purpose of achieving or preserving a value. In relation to his values, man's actions fall into two basic categories: production and consumption. The actions he takes to achieve a value and the actions he takes to use it. The simplest example is the process of attaining food. First, man plants and grows a harvest of wheat and transforms that wheat into bread, which is a series of actions taken to produce a value. Then he eats the bread, which is the action of consuming the value. This is the basic pattern of his activity in relation to values, no matter how complex the actions and values involved. There is a hierarchical relationship among all of man's values. That is, the value which is the end of one action becomes the means for the achievement of another wider value. As, for instance, the consumption of bread is the end or goal of the activity of farming. But that consumption is the means of achieving a wider value, one's survival. Ultimately, all of man's activity, both production and consumption, has two basic final goals, two values which are not means to further ends, but are ends in themselves: the maintenance of his life and its enjoyment. This basic pattern of man's actions in existence has a corresponding pattern of actions within his consciousness. The activity of his consciousness also falls into two basic categories, two functions which constitute the production and the consumption of values, namely thought and emotion. In terms of consciousness, thinking is the activity of perceiving, identifying, and choosing values. Emotion is the activity of using them, of experiencing their meaning in relation to oneself. For instance, thinking is required to gain the knowledge, choose the standard, and identify the value of art. The emotion of pleasure which one experiences when one views a great work of art is one's use, that is, one's consumption, of the value made possible by one's thinking. A man who never chose to rise above the value level of a brute would not experience that pleasure. The fundamental principle in both realms of man's activity, in existence and in consciousness, is that all activity of production must result in a corresponding activity of consumption. Any significant discrepancy between these two activities leads to frustration and suffering. Since man is an integrated unit, and since all of his values and actions are interrelated, both functions of his consciousness, thought and emotion, are involved in all of his activities. He experiences emotional pleasure in the process of productive work, and his thinking is involved in any act of consuming. There can be no totally emotionless production or totally mindless consumption. The difference between these two activities, then, is a difference in the focus of his concern. In productive activity, his concern is centered on his work. In consumption activity, his concern is centered on himself, on his own enjoyment. Production is the process of achieving a future value. Consumption is the enjoyment of a value already achieved. Now, in regard to man's simpler short-range values, the relationship between the activity of production and the activity of consumption is simple and direct, such as the growing and eating of food or the making and wearing of clothes. But in regard to his wider, more intellectual, more abstract values, man has a problem. What is the form of consumption commensurate with the achievement of his great, crucial, long-range values? Psychologically, the pleasure of production is an emotional state accompanying a process of action in reality. But the pleasure of consumption is a positive emotional state, a state existing only inside his own consciousness, with no corresponding action or expression in reality. Where his minor values are concerned, a passive state of rest and satisfied contemplation is an appropriate and sufficient acknowledgement of a minor achievement. But in regard to his major values, in regard to achievements of crucial importance, man feels an intense desire to express his emotional consumption, his victory, his success, his happiness, in action. This desire comes from the need to give an objective form to his happiness, to bring it into reality, not to let it remain a private, subjective state, but to make it objectively real. All of you know the experience of saying or feeling, "I'm so happy I don't know what to do about it," or "I'm so happy I wish I could do something about it." This desire for action comes from the need to balance production and consumption, to bring one's consumption up to a level commensurate with the importance of the value achieved. Since values and action are so crucially interrelated, a value achieved by action and in objective reality demands consumption in action and in objective reality. A great achievement rewarded by nothing but the state of one's own inner consciousness is a frustration. It is in the metaphysical nature of a consciousness, any consciousness, to seek to express its efficacy, its power, its values outside in existence, in reality. This need, the need to objectify one's enjoyment, is filled, is answered by the concept of celebration. What is a celebration? A celebration is an action undertaken not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself, not for the purpose of achieving a value in the future, but for the purpose of giving an objective expression to the enjoyment of a value achieved in the past, most often, but not necessarily in the immediate past. A wedding is a celebration. A birthday party is a celebration. A party in honor of the achievements of a distinguished guest is a celebration. The 4th of July is a national celebration. That typically American holiday, Thanksgiving Day, captures the essence of a celebration, a holiday to celebrate the successful completion of a harvest. Every celebration is an act objectifying the pleasure of consumption after the successful production of a major value. Now I will remind you that man is a being of self-made soul, that of all the values he has to achieve by his own effort, the greatest and most crucial one is himself, that the achievement which makes all his other achievements possible is the creating of his own moral character, the achievement of the values proper to a rational being in his own person. This is the hardest and, in its perfect state, the rarest of all of man's productive achievements, and as such, it requires the greatest kind of consumption pleasure and the most intense form of enjoyment and celebration of it. A celebration which a man would desire the more passionately the greater the value he has made of himself. What form of consumption pleasure and of celebration is open to man to objectify the value of his own person? That consumption pleasure is love. Its celebration is sex. That is, the values of character, the values man achieves in his own person, are the most important values to any man, consciously or subconsciously, no matter what moral standard he has accepted, because they determine all his other values and control his emotional responses. One cannot appraise anything as of value without knowing of value to whom. That which a man values in a human being determines what he will value in all realms and aspects of existence. The pleasure that a man derives from human values consists in essence of two emotions, pride and admiration. The pleasure of pride is his emotional response, his consumption, in answer to his own achievements and to the values he has created in his own character. The pleasure of admiration is his emotional response, his consumption, in answer to the achievements of others and to the values others have created in their own characters. Romantic love is the highest union of these two emotions, the greatest emotional tribute that man can offer to himself and to the person he loves. It is an expression of his own pride and of his admiration for the loved one. It is an emotion that declares in effect, I, who am of great value, recognize the greatness which is you. It has been said that romantic love involves one's whole soul. This is true, in a much more solemn manner than those who say it usually realize. Romantic love is the self-assertion of one's self-esteem, the emotional means of giving objective reality to one's own value. It is a declaration that one has achieved the capacity to value and to be valued, that one is able to admire and worthy of being admired. This is the meaning of Rourke's statement, before one can say I love you, one must be able to say the I. Since virtually no man is totally devoid of some part or remnant of authentic self-esteem, this is the cause of the universal desire for romantic love. It is the desire to objectify the value of one's own person. But since most men's value premises are a mass of semi-conscious evasions and contradictions, so is the course, the errors, and the tragedies of their love life. One falls in love with the person who embodies the same values of character that one esteems in oneself. Not the superficial values, not such nonsense as a sense of humor or she's fun to be with, not any common tastes in dance bands, automobiles, or restaurants, and not any values to which one may choose to pay lip service, but the most essential and metaphysical values of one's actual view of existence. It is one's view of existence that determines one's self-esteem, one's sense of efficacy in dealing with reality. It is that view which determines one's estimate of oneself and of others. One falls in love with the person who appraises existence by the same standard and sees it in the same terms. Emotionally, one experiences it as a feeling that says, in effect, she or he faces life as I do. No, one does not fall in love by conscious, rational calculation. It is the lightning calculator of one's subconscious emotional mechanism that does the calculating and makes one respond when one meets the person who is one's actual soulmate in this deepest metaphysical sense. Not the mate of whatever pretenses one might hold about oneself, but the mate of one's actual soul. In a rational person, there is no conflict between his conscious convictions and his subconscious values, and he falls in love with the person who represents his conscious values. In a neurotic, it is his subconscious values that direct this choice. In both cases, however, as with all other emotions, it is still one's mind that ultimately determines one's values, the thinking one has done or has failed to do. The consumption pleasure of romantic love is that it makes man experience emotionally the objectivity of his own value and the confirmation of his view of existence. So crucial a pleasure requires action to express it. It requires a form of celebration. That form of celebration is sex. The values celebrated in sex are the value of oneself and the value of existence. To a person of full self-esteem, it is a celebration of his own pride and his own efficacy in dealing with a benevolent universe, that is, a universe where man can achieve his values and his happiness by the efficacy of his own effort. What is the unique nature of sexual enjoyment? First, it is the most intense of all human pleasures. There are other pleasures that can last longer across time, but none that is comparable in strength and intensity. Second, it is a pleasure not of the body alone or of the mind alone, but of the person, of the total entity. The pleasure of eating or of swimming is essentially physical. It is a pleasure of the body. The enjoyment of productive work or of witnessing an artistic performance is intellectual. It is a pleasure of the mind. But sexual enjoyment is a pleasure of both. It unites man's mind and body. It integrates sensations, emotions, values, and thought. It offers man the most intense form of experiencing his own total being, of experiencing his deepest and most intimate sense of his own self. The sex act invokes and necessitates the most profound and sweeping physical and spiritual involvement. Everyone knows this introspectively, including the man who, feeling guilty over the act or over his specific choice of partner, retreats into a motionless impersonality the moment afterward and dismisses the experience as meaningless, physiological, and devoid of any value significance whatever. The intensity of any emotion that man experiences is determined by the importance of the values involved. Since sex involves the most cardinal of all human values, it is sex that gives man the most intense pleasure, and it is the subject of sex that arouses the most intense human passions. I have said that in the hierarchical relationship of human values, most values serve as means to further ends, and that the two ultimate ends are the maintenance of man's life and its enjoyment. It is in sex, in the union of self-esteem, of efficacy, and enjoyment that man experiences the reality of this fact, the ultimate meaning of his life and his effort. It is in sex that man experiences the fact of being an end in himself and the feeling that the purpose of life is his own enjoyment. It is in sex that he escapes from any malevolent feeling of life's futility, drudgery, and senseless servitude to incomprehensible ends, which most people experience too often. Sex is the highest form of selfishness in the noblest sense of that word. And this is the reason why all mystics damn sex and why they have to destroy sexual enjoyment in order to destroy man. To damn man's right to pleasure is to damn his self-esteem. To damn his self-esteem is to damn his soul, his essence, and his life. Such is the nature of the mystic's morality. All the ugliness, corruptions, and perversions of sex which the mystics love to denounce are caused at root by a man's acceptance of any part of the mystic's morality. Again, to quote Francisco d'Anconia, quote, "Only the man who extols the purity of a love devoid of desire is capable of the depravity of a desire devoid of love," close quote. To a rational man, meaning in this connection to a healthy man, to a man possessing self-esteem, sex is an expression, an effect of his self-esteem. To an irrational man, it is an attempt to reverse cause and effect and to acquire an illusion of self-esteem through his sexual experience. A rational man's attitude, in effect, is, "I am good and life is good, therefore I am loved and I am able to experience pleasure." An irrational man's attitude, in essence, is, "If I am able to experience pleasure and if someone will love me, that will prove that I am not worthless and that life is not a state of agonizing terror." For the man who possesses self-esteem, the sex act is the expression of his own sense of efficacy, of his sense of self-value, of his will to live. For the man who lacks self-esteem, the sex act is a desperate reaching for the illusion of an efficacy he does not possess. It is the attempt to reverse the law of cause and effect, and by performing the act of a celebration to induce the feeling that he has something to celebrate, that he has achieved the state of fitness for life, and that life is of value to him. The majority of those who lack self-esteem, or lack it to a significant degree, are still physically capable of performing the sex act, though often incompetently, infrequently, and with far from full enjoyment. But such enjoyment as they do achieve is most commonly of the literal moment only. What they feel afterwards, sometimes consciously in words, sometimes as only a numb sensation, is a sense of futility, of frustration, of sadness, of disgust, of shame, of guilt. To such men, sex is a narcotic, a momentary sensation in which to drown their inadequacy and their fear of life. To the man of self-esteem, the enjoyment of sex is an end in itself. What he seeks as his final goal is that literal experience of pleasure, the pleasure he has earned by the values of his character and wishes to experience for its own sake, for the immediate enjoyment of his body and consciousness. But to the man who lacks self-esteem, pleasure is not an end in itself. In the most literal sense of the word, it is not pleasure that he seeks. Sex to him is not an end in itself, but an erotic means to an end. What is his motive and goal in sex? To persuade himself, by means of the response of his partner, that he is worthy of being desired. To persuade himself, by means of any physical sensation of pleasure he can achieve, that he is worthy of experiencing pleasure. To persuade himself that he is masculine. to persuade himself that he is virile, to persuade himself that he is as capable of seducing a woman as any of his friends, to persuade himself that life is not a danger and a threat, that he too is fit to exist, that he is not a helpless alien in a universe where fulfillment is impossible to him. If it is a woman, to persuade herself by means of a man's desire for her that she is objectively worthy of being desired, to persuade herself that she is worthy of experiencing enjoyment, to persuade herself that she is as healthy and normal as any other woman, to persuade herself that she is feminine, to persuade the man to go on caring for and protecting her. This attempted reversal of cause and effect, this use of pleasure as an erotic means to an end, is not restricted to sex. The same principle may be observed in an erotic's pursuit of other pleasures as well. The man who gives a party not because he has anything to celebrate, but as a substitute for having something to celebrate, not as an expression of happiness, but as a means of escaping boredom. The woman who wants a mink coat, not for the pleasure and comfort of wearing it, but for the social metaphysical satisfaction of impressing her friends. The playboy who runs from nightclubs to yacht cruises in order to persuade himself that he hasn't a care in the world, in order to evade the knowledge that he's a restlessly worthless bum. The husband who conscientiously takes his wife dancing every weekend in order to conceal from her and from himself that they bore each other to death and that their marriage is a failure. These are people who go through the motions of pursuing pleasure but are incapable of achieving it. Such people are often described as pleasure chasers, but the truth is that pleasure is precisely what they are not chasing. What they are chasing but cannot attain by the means they have chosen is their betrayed self-esteem and their sense of a benevolent universe, that is, of a universe in which happiness and fulfillment are possible to them. It is a man's view of himself and of existence that will determine what he seeks from the act of sex, and what he seeks from the act of sex will determine what kind of partner he will choose. This leads us to the meaning of Francisco's statement, "Tell me what a man finds sexually attractive, and I will tell you his entire philosophy of life." Consider, first of all, the case of Hank Rearden in Atlas Shrugged. Rearden is a man fully possessed of self-esteem and fully in love with life, but he is a man who has made a tragic error, that of believing that his sexual desires bear no relation to his spiritual values. Because Rearden is a man of such great self-esteem, and because he is so profoundly psychologically healthy, he is unable to damn sex completely, unable really to believe that it is evil, and unable therefore to resist his passion for Dagny Taggart, the greatest woman he has ever met. His tragedy is that he does attempt to damn himself for his desire for Dagny, and the story shows the gradual steps by which he learns the actual meaning of sex and the philosophical source of his own desires. You will remember the scene in Rearden's office when Rearden comes, finally and fully, to perceive the nature of his error. He remembers the day when he had met Dagny for the first time. He had never seen her before. He knew only that she was reputed to be the mind that was holding Taggart Transcontinental together, the one person of real ability who was maintaining the railroad almost single-handedly. His first appointment with her was at a railroad siding. When Rearden arrived there, he saw a young, slim woman in a gray suit standing on top of a flat car, proudly, happily, and confidently, pointing off in the distance and giving instructions concerning the work. Rearden looked at her. He did not know who she was. No thought of sex was in his mind. He was surrendered to a moment of pure ascetic appreciation and enjoyment at a lovely sight, with no thought or connection to himself. Then he asked a passerby who the young woman was, and was told, Dagny Taggart. In the next instant, faster than any thought could take shape in words, Rearden felt a sudden, sweeping, and violent desire, the most intense desire he had ever experienced. What created that desire? It was the lightning calculator of Rearden's subconscious, summing up the inexorable logic of his deepest premises, integrating the sight of this woman, the implications of her manner and posture, and the kind of mind and character that Dagny was said to possess, leading to the knowledge that this was his spiritual mate, the woman he had not known he had been seeking all his life, the woman who faced existence as he faced it and embodied the same values. It was an answer to this knowledge that Rearden's body and emotions responded. Remembering that day, and now clearly seeing its meaning, Rearden drops the chains of the self-torture he had been enduring, and he thinks, quote, I damned the fact that my mind and body were a unit, and that my body responded to the values of my mind. I damned the fact that joy is the core of existence, the motive power of every living being, that it is the need of one's body as it is the goal of one's spirit, that my body was not a weight of inanimate muscles, but an instrument able to give me an experience of superlative joy to unite my flesh and my spirit. That capacity, which I damned as shameful, had left me indifferent to sluts, but gave me my one desire in answer to a woman's greatness. That desire, which I damned as obscene, did not come from the sight of her body, but from the knowledge that the lovely form I saw did express the spirit I was seeing. It was not her body that I wanted, but her person. It was not the girl in gray that I had to possess, but the woman who ran the railroad. Close quote. The qualities that Reardon finds sexually inspiring are pride, self-confidence, intelligence. Yet these are the very qualities that many men would find most incompatible with feminine sex appeal. Would any of you care to claim that it tells one nothing about a man's character, whether he finds these qualities romantically attractive or romantically paralyzing? If for Reardon, sex is an act of self-celebration, the expression of an actual self-esteem, he necessarily would desire the highest woman he could find, the woman most like himself, the woman capable of knowing and of being equal to the values he wishes to celebrate. A woman without mind, character, or values, a woman without self-esteem, could not offer Reardon the experience he wanted, as she could not offer it to any man of authentic self-value. Her surrender could mean nothing to such a man if he knew that she equally well could have surrendered to a far lesser man. Her desire for him could mean nothing if he knew that she regarded sex as a meaningless act of animal self-indulgence. For the same reason, a woman such as Dagny would always desire a hero. She, or any woman of comparable self-esteem, would regard it as a humiliating self-degradation and as a contradiction of that which she desired from sex to sleep with a man she regarded as her inferior, a man who could not feel the meaning of this act as she felt it, and was unequal to the values she sought to express. But there are women for whom respect and admiration are not the preconditions of sexual desire, but the enemy of sexual desire. There are women who can feel desire only when they can also feel some element of contempt. Would any of you care to claim that this tells one nothing about a woman's character and values? Now, when a man such as Reardon discovers the philosophical meaning of his desire for Dagny, this is a source of pleasure to him because he has reason to be proud of his choice and of what it indicates about himself. But the man who is lacking in self-esteem will not want to know the meaning of his sexual choices because of what he would then have to face in his own character. Consider the famous passion of Philip for Mildred in Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. Maugham, the author, is a mystic committed to the soul-body dichotomy. In the character of Philip, he shows a sensitive intellectual man caught in a helpless sexual bondage to a slut from the gutter, a slut totally devoid of any values of intellect or spirit. Maugham does not offer any explanation of Philip's psychology. He in effect projects it as an unaccountable mystery of human nature, and the story is usually taken to represent the impotence of mind and values in the face of passion. But from the very material that Maugham so graphically presents, one can see the explanation, an explanation that is diametrically opposed to the standard interpretation. Philip, you will remember, is, for all his intellectual aspirations and pretensions, a man with a desperate sense of inferiority. He has a clubfoot of which he feels deeply ashamed. He doubts his masculinity. He compares himself unfavorably with the men around him. He is inordinately anxious to be liked and approved of, and is highly sensitive to the appraisal of others. One day he enters a restaurant and attempts a minor flirtation with the waitress, Mildred. He is not particularly interested in her and does not find her especially attractive. Her manner is crude and vulgar. But she snubs him. He leaves the restaurant, but he finds that he cannot get her out of his mind. He returns again and again. He proceeds to court her. He persists in spite of her obvious indifference and contempt. He willingly endures one humiliation after another in order to be with her, and he feels that he will die if he cannot sexually possess her. Now, what is his motive? If it were merely a physical passion, which is what the story is generally held to mean, there would be no way to explain why he desires specifically Mildred. No way to explain why any other woman would not do just as well. But the truth is that it is not sexual pleasure that Philip is so frantically pursuing. It is self-esteem. Because he has an inferiority complex and secretly doubts his masculinity, he takes Mildred's indifference as an unbearable assault on his manhood, and he is driven compulsively to win her surrender in order to ameliorate the pain of his wounded self-value. He feels, in effect, if even she snubs me, what am I? Philip, like Mom, is by basic attitude a mystic, and like every mystic, he feels inadequate to practical reality, which he has divorced from values and intellect. That is why he would feel that it is precisely Mildred who is at home in and control of reality, that is, metaphysically at home and in control. For this reason, he feels that possessing her will be a proof of his own efficacy, a sign that he is as much at home in practical reality as the other men he knows, most of whom would have no difficulty at all in seducing a Mildred. Why does he believe that Mildred is in control of practical reality in spite of all the difficulties and problems from which he constantly has to save her? Because she is mindless, because she has no values, because she is utterly common, because she is not an impractical intellectual like himself. It is significant in this context that Philip is sexually indifferent to another woman in the story, Nora, who is intelligent and whom he respects and esteems. He tells himself that he should love her, but he cannot. He can feel affection for her, but not passion. At the end of the novel, when, worn out by disgust, Philip has finally rid himself of his obsession with Mildred, he falls in love with Sally, a nice little non-intellectual farm girl. The implication is that now Philip is free of his problems and will find true happiness. But if one looks deeper, one sees in fact that Philip has never really escaped Mildred. He has merely fallen in love with another variant. Sally is not vicious or cruel like Mildred. She is simple, straightforward, and unassuming. But she is utterly commonplace, utterly undistinguished, totally devoid of any serious spiritual values. And in proposing marriage to her, Philip gives up his aspirations and sinks into the open and explicit mediocrity that he had always longed to escape, the mediocrity that represents his true soul and actual values. Philip's bondage is not to Mildred or to Sally, but to his own deepest premises, which he never dared to face. Fully as much as Reardon, it was his most profound view of himself and of existence that Philip revealed in his sexual desires. The difference is only that Reardon would be glad to know it. Philip wouldn't. What is Philip's view of himself? Utter self-contempt. What is his view of existence? A universe of futility. Let me now briefly tell you the story of a patient I once treated who also did not want to know the meaning and implications of his choice of sexual partner. He was an exceptionally neurotic individual, most conspicuously lacking in even the rudiments of self-esteem. He quoted the lines from Hausmann's poem in order best to describe himself: "A stranger and afraid in a world I never made." He was an arch social metaphysician. Professionally, he worked in an artistic field and was inclined to be more than slightly intellectually pretentious. When I advanced the theory of sex that I'm expounding to you now, he protested violently. "Oh, no," he declared to me. "Now, if you were talking about love, Mr. Brandon, and if you said that in love we reveal our deepest values, probably I'd agree. But not if you're talking about sex. Sex has nothing to do with anything. Let me give you an example to show you my point. Some time ago, I had to take a train trip, and on the trip I met a rather attractive woman. We talked for a little while, not about anything serious. We really had nothing in common. She shared none of my intellectual interests. But anyway, we ended up by going to bed together. Next morning, she got off the train, and so did I. We went our separate ways and never saw each other again. Now, what was philosophical about it? What did my view of myself or of existence have to do with any of it? It's interesting," I said to him, "how people who are afraid and lonely sense each other out, just as people who are self-confident can usually recognize each other immediately. You meet this woman, you begin to talk. You're not talking about anything important, but by the kind of irrelevancies you do choose to talk about, by the odd little jumps and non sequiturs in the conversation, by your general manner, You're communicating a great deal to each other, but none of it is verbal, none of it is conceptualized. It's all done by means of emotional vibrations. But here's what you're telling her. I'm lonely, I'm frightened, I'm in a bewildering and incomprehensible universe, and you feel the same way. And she's broadcasting that same message to you. What was your real motive in going to bed together? Both of you were feeling, and it's as if you were silently crying into each other, let me feel, if only for a few minutes, that I'm a human being, that somebody wants me, that I matter to somebody, that I don't have to be always alone. Let me have an instant of warmth and closeness and pleasure. Let me drown out the emptiness and feel that I'm of value. Let's hang on to each other and blot out the vacuum. Then, next morning, you wake up and she's watching you nervously to see if you despise her. And then you say goodbye and walk away, each of you wondering, now what did I do that for? And knowing that you'd probably do it again. Now tell me, was that woman, despite all of your differences, your soulmate, or wasn't she? To give the man credit, he looked at me. His face was white, and he admitted that this was a completely accurate description of his emotional state, that such had been the motive and the meaning of his act, even though he had never identified it. Is it necessary to point out more explicitly this man's view of himself and of existence? Then there was the patient, a woman in her 30s, who was passionately attracted to a man she knew to be a scoundrel. He treated her cruelly, made dates with other women in her presence, lied to her, and then admitted it openly and laughed about it. But she felt she couldn't live without him. How many torch songs have been written on this theme? What was this woman's motive? She wanted desperately to be taken care of. She felt chronic anxiety in all social situations, and she wanted the sanction and protection of a man who, by her barbaric standards, seemed fearless. She was so lacking in self-esteem herself that she construed his cruelty as strength, since she would never have the, quote, courage, close quote, to abuse people as he did. While she did not grasp its full extent, she was by no means totally unaware of his weakness. That was a crucial ingredient of his desirability for her. She was sensitive enough dimly to know that in some way he needed her too, as a sadist needs a masochist, and it was the common brotherhood of guilt and weakness, mixed with his social aggressiveness, that made her respond to him as to a soulmate and protector. What was the meaning of the sex act to this woman? It was the proof that she was a woman, that she was worthy of a man's desire, that someone did not reject her. It was a moment's respite from a terrifying universe. If a woman is romantically attracted to a man of demanding standards, if she is romantically attracted to rationality, integrity, self-confidence, and ambitiousness, she reveals one kind of soul. If she is attracted to irresponsibility, self-indulgence, and sadism in a man, she reveals another kind of soul. If she is attracted to social respectability, affluence, and conventional charm, she reveals still another kind of soul. If what a man seeks in sex is a heroine, if the emotion he desires to feel is admiration, he reveals one kind of soul. If what he seeks is forgiveness and mutual self-indulgence, he reveals another kind of soul. And if what he seeks is a mother, he reveals still another kind of soul. If what a man or woman seeks in the act of sex is a celebration of their love of life, they reveal one kind of attitude toward existence. But if what they seek is protection from life, if what they seek is consolation or amelioration of despair, they reveal quite a different attitude toward existence. Premises like murder will out, and above all, in what one pursues for enjoyment. It is the man or woman seemingly without standards, the chaser, the person who is sexually promiscuous, who most eloquently confesses his lack of self-esteem and fear of life. Whether it be the man who is out to conquer any woman or the woman who is willing to surrender to any man, their basic motive is the same, to reverse cause and effect and to seek self-esteem by the tribute implied in their partner's response, and to gain relief from the feeling of a malevolent universe. The key to such people's motive and the proof that sexual pleasure is not their goal is their compulsive, constant changing of partners, their inability to find happiness with any single individual, their constant need for the reaffirmation of their personal worth by some new consciousness. Very often, such people will rationalize. They will tell themselves that they are not promiscuous by basic inclination, but have just been unlucky in their choice of partners, and never stop to ask themselves why they are unlucky, why they are always bored or disappointed a month later, a week later, or else next morning. They never stop to ask by what standard they chose their partners in the first place and what they expect to happen when they choose without standards on the whim, impulse, mood, or terror of the moment. The evil of promiscuity is not that one pursues pleasure or sexual enjoyment, but that one debases and degrades them by making them meaningless and mindless, that one abandons one's judgment, one's reason, and any serious values one may possess. Promiscuity is immoral because it is an affront to the nature of sex, not because sex is immoral. Promiscuity is not possible without evasion, and many a sexually promiscuous patient has confessed to me that if, in the moment of performing the sexual act, he or she fully focused on their actual estimate of the character of their partner, they would become impotent or frigid. For a man or a woman of self-esteem who falls in love by rational values, it is precisely that focus that is most sexually inspiring. When consciousness becomes a threat to pleasure, that is the evidence that one is acting irrationally and self-defeatingly. If one cannot look at one's sexual partner in the light of full consciousness, if one cannot say, this is my choice, these are my values, this is what I seek for pleasure, then one can know that there is a contradiction in one's premises, a clash between one's conscious philosophy and one's deepest values, a discrepancy between one's professed image of oneself and one's actual self-estimate and soul. It is the metaphysical meaning of sex in human life that determines the proper nature of man-woman relationships. You have all heard it said that in romance, man is the dominant agent and woman is submissive, that man is active and woman is passive, that man is the initiator and woman is the responder. There is an important sense in which this is true, but it is necessary carefully to define what one means by these concepts. In intelligence, in intellectual independence, in creative capacity, and in moral stature, man and woman are fully equal. Woman is not man's metaphysical inferior or slave, but their sexual roles are different. The difference proceeds from differences in their nature and pertains exclusively to their romantic relationship, not to the other aspects of their lives. In sex, man is the prime mover. By biological necessity, by anatomical necessity, the sex act depends upon his will and choice. Without that act of choice, no sexual relationship is physically possible. A man can take a woman without her consent, but without the consent of the man, the woman is helpless. In this sense, she is totally dependent on his will. In the act itself, man is the chief creator of pleasure. This does not mean that woman can only remain passive, do nothing, and contribute nothing in the sense of active participation. Far from it. It is precisely the woman's participation that the man desires. But the fact remains that man carries the basic power of achieving his own pleasure and that of the woman. If sex were not of such crucial importance in human life, the anatomical difference between man and woman would be psychologically irrelevant and without particular consequence. But because pleasure, and above all sexual pleasure, is so urgent and fundamental a need, this difference between man and woman sets the basic nature of their entire relationship. Romantically, man is properly the initiator and aggressor, woman is properly the reactor and responder. This does not mean that a woman must conceal her admiration for a man until he has expressed an interest in her, and it certainly does not mean that once he has expressed an interest, she must remain passive and only respond to that which he initiates. The principle of dominance and submission defines only the basic emotional style of the relationship, the essential theme of the romance, as it were, a theme that is capable of many forms of expression. The qualities of character that they should seek in each other are, of course, the same, that is, the values proper to a rational being. The proper basis of love for both is admiration. But a rational, self-confident woman wants a man who is strong enough to dominate her sexually and romantically. A rational man wants a woman who is strong enough to be worth dominating. In love, a woman of self-esteem desires a hero. A man of self-esteem desires a hero worshiper, not a clinging vine. Now, why does a woman of self-esteem desire a hero? Because for a woman, sex is an act of surrender and is proper only as tribute, only as an acknowledgement of virtue. Why does a man of self-esteem desire a hero worshiper? Because for man, sex is an act of conquest, and a hero worshiper is a woman of exacting standards, not to be conquered save by the man who is able to meet them. You will now understand the answer to a question which I am sometimes asked. Why is there an element of conflict, the suggestion of adversaries, in the love scenes of Ayn Rand's novels? The purpose is to isolate and underscore the character of the participants and the essence of the spirit of sex, of man as a conqueror and woman as a being who has to be conquered. Conquered by what? Not by brute strength, but by values, by greatness, by the intensity of her own admiration. Do not make the error of believing that sadism and masochism are merely exaggerated extensions of healthy masculine dominance and feminine submissiveness. Sadism and masochism are the exact antithesis, the expression not of self-esteem but of self-contempt. The power of a healthy man over a woman is the power to produce pleasure. This is the diametrical opposite of the power sought by the sadist. The sadist's goal is the power to inflict pain. A healthy woman expresses her love by her acknowledgement of the pleasure the man has the power to give her and of her need for that pleasure. But a masochist's expression of love is her willingness to endure suffering. It is an altogether different motivation whether a woman wants a hero or a master, whether she wants a man to admire or a man to assume responsibility for her life and absolve her of the need to think and make decisions. It is an altogether different motivation whether a man wants a hero worshiper or a clinging vine, whether he wants the appreciation of a woman with high standards or the unquestioning obedience of a woman with no standards at all. There is nothing more terrifying to a woman without self-esteem than a hero worshiper. A woman of moral judgment who expects man to be a hero and will accept nothing less, who will respond neither to cuteness nor to charm nor to swaggering pretentiousness, but only to authentic self-confidence. The man without self-esteem runs from such women. He often tells himself that he regards them as sexless, but the truth is that it is they who make him feel sexless. Who does such a man find feminine and sexually appealing? The kind of movie star, symbolized some years ago by Betty Grable, who looks out from the screen at millions of men and projects to them, "Anyone could win me, even you." I have pointed out that the root of the mystics' damnation of sex is their damnation of pleasure. The root of their damnation of pleasure is, of course, their damnation of life. It is impossible to calculate the enormity of the suffering caused by their anti-sex doctrines. The lives wrecked by guilt, by fear, by impotence and frigidity, by every kind of sexual neurosis, to say nothing of the monstrous laws instigated by mystics that forbid abortions and thus result in the literal murder of thousands of women at the hands of quacks. But what you must understand, and what too few of those who attempt to fight the mystics' influence in sex do understand, is that this is a moral issue, a philosophical issue, and can be fought successfully only as such. It is a battle that cannot be won by defending sex out of context and in a vacuum. So long as psychologists and psychiatrists answer the accusation that sex is only an animal indulgence, with the defense that man is only an animal and should not be restrained by artificial taboos, the victims of their ignorance and cowardice will continue to number in the millions. The battle for sex can be won only by challenging the mystics' entire morality of death, the morality that divorces and opposes pleasure and values, and by upholding the morality of life, by upholding the philosophical meaning of pleasure and man's moral right to the selfish pursuit of the enjoyment of existence. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.